Welcome back into the GSMC Sports Podcast. We just finished up talking about the New York Jets and the offseason that they have been working through so far, the additions they've made. Now we are going to be switching gears to the NBA, starting with Victor Wembanyama of the San Antonio Spurs and his chances of winning the Defensive Player of the Year award. Really, for the past few months, the conversation has been between him and Rudy Gobert of the Timberwolves, but we've seen Wemby climbing his way up into this conversation even more seriously over the course of the past month, where he was around plus 1,000 coming out of the All-Star break. He's now plus 400 or lower on the big sports books. So we've seen this become more of a real possibility and gaining traction. It's helped that Rudy Gobert has been missing some games as of late, which has opened the window a little bit more. This really comes down to the individual accomplishments of Victor Wembanyama versus the traditional mindset that comes with this award in terms of being... It's not always being the best defensive player on the best defensive team, but there is some level that we've seen historically in terms of having players be on good defenses, and Wemby would really be pushing it here, where the Spurs are 23rd in defensive rating this season. Not that it's the number one stat, of course, when weighing all of this, but when you look at opponents' points in the paint, the Spurs are 28th in that. But granted, the team is 11.5 points per 100 possessions better on the defensive end than with him on the court than off, which is saying a lot because they're already a bad defense in general. Take Wemby out of this and we're looking at probably historically bad stuff with them. But this is the situation that Wemby is in versus Rudy Gobert on the Timberwolves, where they are number one in defensive rating. They're number two in opponents' points in the paint per game. Now, points in the paint, again, not the number one stat, of course, when you're talking about Defensive Player of the Year, but we are talking about the anchors in the paint on both of these. It is something, it was just a number that stood out to me, the difference in these, and obviously Wemby can't do everything when it comes to the perimeter and the paint. It also leads to the fact that the Spurs are not very good at closing out on the perimeter. That oftentimes leads to extra drives for opposing teams and some help defense where, again, not all on Wemby. I'm just throwing this out here as a thought. But since 2000, there have only been two players in the NBA to win Defensive Player of the Year with a team ranking outside of the top 5 in defensive rating. That was Marcus Camby doing it with the Nuggets in 2006-2007 when the Nuggets were 12th in defensive rating, and Ben Wallace with the Pistons in 2001-2002 as Detroit was 8th in defensive rating. In 06-07, there was a sizable discrepancy between Camby's Nuggets and the runner-up, Bruce Bowen's team defensively. Bowen was on the Spurs. They were second in defensive rating to that 12th of Denver. But so not quite the gap that we see right now between Gobert and Wembanyama. Still technically a top half of the league defensive rating, but when you look at this too, Bowen was under 1 steals per game, under 1 blocks per game, was not rebounding for them, and played a forward position, which is traditionally not as impactful in terms of carrying a defense. Meanwhile, Camby was averaging, it was 3.5 blocks, and he was having himself a monster season that statistically he was off the charts better. Statistically off the charts better, Bowen was not really there in terms of statistics, and the Nuggets defense was still fine. It was 3.3 blocks per game for Camby, as well as 1.2 steals per game. So that is the situation surrounding that. In 2001, 2002, the runner-up to Ben Wallace was Kevin Garnett, who was actually on a worse defensive team with the Minnesota Timberwolves. They were outside of that top half of the league in defensive rating. Now we have Wemby here, again, 23rd in defensive rating. Not that I want to shove that particular stat down your throats. I just feel like it is indicative of sort of what we're talking about here, where traditionally in the NBA, not that it's an individual award, not a team award. MVP, All-NBA discussions, that it has more to do with winning in particular. Defensive Player of the Year is not the same level, but if you do look in the turn of the century, it has still been a factor how good the team's defense is as a whole. It's not just about individual stats. That being said, if we're talking individual stats, Wemby is doing everything he possibly could to break the tradition of what's happened with this award, where he's averaging 3.5 blocks per game, 1.3 steals per game, and since the All-Star break especially, he has become a different level of defender. 4.8 blocks per game, 1.8 steals per game. Gobert's numbers do not compare the same. They're still not bad. I know that they're not quite as eye-popping as Wemby, but it's 2.1 blocks per game, 1.5 steals per game. Now, it's really interesting how you want to choose to weigh basically all of this information and factors that we've been spewing out here, because Rudy Gobert, he doesn't have necessarily the same numbers as a whole, but Wemby's getting a lot of opportunities because of the remainder of his defense is not good. That being said, Rudy Gobert is also still contesting more shots per game than Wemby is if you look at the hustle stats for him, which again, sort of do with that what you will. It's really interesting to see how you want to sort of weigh all of these different factors, where for me, I feel like, I don't know, maybe I'm a little bit more traditional. Wemby's time is going to come. He had the quote himself where he said, let him win it this year, because after that, it's not his turn anymore, which Wemby is just so good on the microphone. He is such an ideal candidate to be the face of the league, that I do think that is sort of the direction we're headed in the NBA. Not that that means that we can afford necessarily to steal an award for him, but again, it's really tough when you look at, if your argument is team success shouldn't matter, this is an individual award, not a team award, I really don't have much of a counter argument other than that this is what it has been through the history of the award. I don't think that's even necessarily fair, so I don't feel strongly about it one way or another. This would be a huge turning point if Wemby were able to win the Defensive Player of the Year award, because I do think that long term it could potentially have a ripple effect on how we judge some individual candidates on whether or not they should be worthy for the award. So it's finding that line of whether or not the individual statistics can overtake the general eye test. Again, eye test also goes to Wemby too, so I don't even know if that's the right way to put it either. It's such a complicated debate, I feel like, and it stems from the fact that, unfortunately for Wemby, he was the number one overall pick because the Spurs are as bad as they are. And ultimately, he's going to be an all-NBA first-team player anyways, so it just comes down to this one award, this one season as it is. I don't think that this is going to be a long-term trend in terms of the Spurs being this bad defensively. You have to hope that I'm not saying go all in. I think that some of the discourse with national media is so ridiculous that there's this ticking clock. All of us as NBA fans should want to see the Spurs try and compete at a higher level, but to say that Wembanyama is, or the Spurs really from an organizational standpoint, are under this extreme pressure from Wemby himself, they're more under pressure from the national media, because all of us want to see Victor Wembanyama be on good teams. Sometimes when I've sat down to watch him, I'm sitting through these disastrous games because I'm looking to see the flashes. One of those times that's really stuck out to me was one of those matchups between the Spurs and the Thunder, where in a 20-plus point game, the Wembanyama versus Chet Holmgren rivalry started to heat up a little bit, and we saw the two going back and forth at one another, and it was one of the best sort of visual moments of Wemby's rookie year. And again, this was taking place in a blowout loss, which I personally can look past, but it did sort of undermine the moment where we got to see Wemby and the Spurs get their revenge against Chet a couple months later. But again, I'm just saying, I think it's really interesting to sort of evaluate the situation that the Spurs are in and that Wemby is in. If Rudy Gobert continues to miss games, I do believe that this becomes a lot more interesting, because we're seeing, again, not that I want to overly rely on the points in the paint statistic, but we've seen teams been against the Timberwolves in these recent games be able to get to the paint against them, and they're still winning some of these matchups, so it's not like they're on this big losing streak, but it does sort of open the door that much more for Wembanyama to overtake Rudy Gobert. But we'll see. I'm curious how this is all going to play out. Again, if I were to bet on this, I think that Rudy Gobert is going to bring it home because of the traditional weight that has come with this, but I do think that it's going to be very interesting to see how we as NBA fans and how the voters of the award are going to weigh the team's defense as a whole in comparison to the individual player. Because again, I know that it's defensive rating as a team is a team stat. Your defensive player of the year can very much influence how good your defense is, and Rudy Gobert has won defensive player of the year now 3 times. He has a chance to get his 4th, and every year that he was with the Utah Jazz, they were a good defensive team because he was the one manning the middle for them. So his impact does go, in my opinion, beyond just the statistics that we typically see. But on that note, we are going to be taking our second break, and when we come back on the other side, we will be getting into the New Orleans Pelicans, who are on a bit of a winning streak here, and I believe are emerging as a potential dark horse team in the Western Conference. So stick with us, and we will be right back.